What happens when the core beliefs of the Christian faith come directly into conflict with evidence that the gospel stories were borrowed from older pre-existent writings? What would happen if it were demonstrated that the New Testament gospels not only inserted corollary motifs in some sporadic manner, but instead used sequential and distinctive markers which display the fingerprints of direct mimicry? In today's video, you just might find out. Hi, I'm Justin Best with Bust and Just. Thank you for joining me in today's study. And today what I'll be doing is reading to you and commenting on an article that I recently published on bustandjust.com called Mimesis in Mark, Evidence Homer Inspired the Gospels. But if this is your first time watching one of my videos, do me a favor and go ahead and hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon so you can be notified whenever I post. But without further ado, let's just jump right into this and look at what we have. And of course, I will leave the link for this article in the description box so you guys can click and follow along below, or of course read and click through all the different links that I've provided for you in the article to dig in deeper as well. So here we go. Mimesis in Mark, Evidence Homer Inspired the Gospels. For centuries, there has been immense debate about the authenticity and historicity of biblical literature and the characters contained within it. For those scholars responding most directly to Christian ideologies, whether they're doing so as a proponent or a skeptic, the books of the New Testament seem to be the primary and most advantageous battleground. Simply, the skeptical scholar might assume the conclusion that if the books of the New Testament are proven to be non-literal or lacking in historic and scientific basis, that it would quickly dismantle the very foundations of the Christian faith, specifically the Gospels. Alternatively, the Christian scholar understands that in order to maintain the traditional philosophies and ideologies of Christianity, the New Testament must be held in high esteem as a literal and historically true work of God brought about by supernatural spiritual means. In other words, one of the primary Christian beliefs which holds quote-unquote true doctrine in place is that the New Testament is an original, authentic, and God-inspired work that accurately details the historic events of Jesus Christ. But what happens when these core beliefs of the Christian faith come directly into conflict with evidence that the gospel stories were borrowed from older pre-existent writings? What would happen if it were demonstrated that the New Testament Gospels not only inserted corollary motifs in some sporadic manner, but instead used sequential and distinctive markers which display the fingerprints of direct mimicry? In this article, you might find out. In his groundbreaking research, Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald pioneers a process called Mimesis criticism, which is a method of interpreting texts in relation to their literary or cultural models. And just as a reminder, guys, for those of you who do decide to come to the actual website, you can click through and learn more about all the different links that I provide for Dr. Dennis MacDonald for Mimesis criticism, and of course I link some different books and works in here as well if you want to go check those out. Mimesis criticism looks to identify intertextual relationships between two texts that go beyond simple echoes, allusions, citations, or redactions. The effects of imitation are usually manifested in the later text by means of distinct characterization, motifs, and/or plot structure. So in layman's terms, this means that mimesis criticism is a process by which scholars identify sequential and distinctive clues or markers which demonstrate that one text conclusively served as a framework for another. A statement from detractors seeking to discredit this method might say, just because you find analogies between two stories in one gospel and one in Homer, it doesn't mean that there's a literary connection. That's right, says Dr. MacDonald. On the surface, it doesn't. But my question then is, how many whiskers make a beard? As it pertains to the study and development of mimesis criticism, that truly is the million-dollar question. How many whiskers make a beard? MacDonald continues, quote, "What I mean by that is how many parallels in sequence and distinctiveness do you need in order to have mimesis criticism and to have imitation? Another way to put it is how many beans make a pile. Yes, you can have parallels between texts that have no literary connection, and you can have parallels between texts that do have literary connection. I'd like to know what criteria you're going to use to make that judgment, and then we can compare them to the stories. So unless you have a criteria, I'm going to assume that the question of how many whiskers make a beard is open. Exactly, that's a very good question. And here's a little image of one of the key books that we're going to be looking at today. Is called The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark by Dr. MacDonald. And here's a quote that I added from Richard Carrier, PhD. Shout out to Richard Carrier. I don't know if he'll ever see this, but I read his review of Dr. MacDonald's work, and it was also really good. And Richard Carrier says, several scholars who reviewed or commented on it have said that this book will revolutionize the field of gospel studies and profoundly affect our understanding of the origins of Christianity. And though I had taken this for hype, after reading the book, I now echo that very sentiment myself. Very cool. Okay, the 6 criteria. In order to prevent subjectivity, Dr. MacDonald suggested 6 criteria for determining whether a claim for a mimetic connection between texts is reasonable. The first 2 criteria concern the status of the text used as a model. So the first 2 criteria deal with the original text that's being used as a model or framework to be copied from, or to be mimed, right? Also called the anti-text, or the text being used as a framework for another. And the final 4 criteria below concern the later text that may have used the anti-text. So the last 4 have to do with the text that's being written as a mimetic copy of the prior. So here's the 6 criteria that Dr. MacDonald proposes. First is accessibility. One must demonstrate that the author of the later text would have been reasonably able to access a copy of the text being imitated. Was the anti-text well known or obscure at the time of the later text's composition? So in this case, for example, we're dealing specifically with Mark. The question were the stories of Homer accessible and available and known to whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark? That would be the question of accessibility. Number 2 is analogy. If one text is discovered to imitate a certain anti-text, it is probable that the other texts have also done so. Are there examples of other authors using this anti-text as a literary model? So again, for this specific article and this specific video today, there's so many other ways to look at this. We're talking about the Gospel of Mark. So the question would be, if the Gospel of Mark was somehow influenced by Homeric writings, can we see that other people also copied Homer in their writings? And of course, the answer we know is yes. So analogy is the second criteria. Third is density. And this, to me, density, order, and distinctive traits, the next 3 are just massive. I mean, mathematically, probably, I don't know, improbable is the great, funny I use that word. Mathematically impossible, implausible, in my opinion, that you could have so much density, order, and distinctive traits. But we're going to go into that in a minute. But density is the greater number of parallels one can induce between 2 texts. The stronger one's case will be for a mimetic relationship between them. So the more 2 texts have in common with each other, the more dense there are in commonalities, the more likely it is that one copied the other, or one used the other for a framework, that there is a mimetic connection. Number 4, order. The more frequently the parallels between 2 texts follow the same order, the less likely it becomes that the parallels are not just coincidental. And to me, this is where I think the real math comes in. And I need to dig into this more, because maybe there's a way we could build a model. Maybe a model has already been built concerning this idea. But when parallels are not only dense, but they're also in order, meaning we're going to show you 30-something ordered parallels in a minute here in a row, it really, really lends credibility to Mimesis criticism, because it's completely improbable, maybe even impossible, that some of these things would line up in order the way that they have sequentially. And then fifth is distinctive traits. And this is, again, density, order, and distinctive traits to me are huge. Distinctive traits. If there are parallels between two texts, but none of the parallels are anything but one would expect in their respective contexts, then it becomes difficult to argue for mimetic connection. Especially helpful are non sequiturs or other unusual elements present in later texts which parallel the proposed model. It is also typical for authors to use significant names to alert the reader to the textual interplay. So in other words, you have to have distinctive traits in the text. It can't be too vague or you can't draw parallels too vaguely. You can't be, well, this guy was a human and that guy was a human, and that's all you have. It has to be much more distinctive. There's usually like he says here, there's usually some kind of clue or a name or a word used that kind of clues in the reader that, hey, we're intentionally miming or creating a mimetic connection to a previous text. And we'll see that as well with the name Eurycleia farther along in this study. So number 6 is interpretability. A common motivation for imitating an earlier text is to rival that text, whether philosophically, theologically, politically, or otherwise. So if one can determine such a motivation in a compelling fashion, there is a stronger case for imitation. So if you can create a compelling case that there is a reason for one person to mimic the other, then that also adds to the credibility, according to these criteria, that there is a mimetic connection. So really, when you combine all these things together, and I'm not going to try and go too far off script here, but when you combine all of these elements together, you really get, in my opinion, I think Dr. MacDonald is proposing some really good criteria, and I think you really get a good astringent way of kind of cutting out the stuff that's too vague and keeping the stuff that really is there. So without any further delay, allow me to now share a small example of the mimetic connections in the Gospel of Mark brought forward in Dr. MacDonald's book, Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark. It will be from this perspective that scholars may begin to truly digest the sheer impossibility of these connections, lest they were created intentionally. All right, in the following text, it can't be emphasized enough that these 16 examples, and it's actually 32 examples, I guess, or more, probably, because it's 16 pairings, which I'll show you here. These 16 examples are sequential, which means they're in order to each other. They're dense, that's 2, and they're highly distinctive, that's 3. The events that took place in each story are compared in the actual order they were written down by the authors. The designation of, quote, Homer here below represents sequential statements from Homer's The Odyssey, written in the 8th or 7th century BCE, and it was part of the Greek literary canon by the 6th century BCE. And then the designation of, quote, Mark here below represents the sequential statements from Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 4, and also verses 28 through 37, as well as Mark 14, verses 1 through 11. So really we're doing, looking at Mark 13, chapter 13 and chapter 14 for the most part. So reading through both texts sequentially, the following mimetic connections between the two texts is demonstrated. Okay, I'm just going to read Homer and then say what Homer's text states, and then read Mark and then explain Mark's context as well. And we'll go through and we'll see the sequential statements as they play out through both of these stories. Homer. Telemachus was amazed at the great light that shone on the walls of his house. Mark. One of Jesus' disciples was amazed at the great buildings in Jerusalem temple. So there's the first clue. They're both amazed, right? Moving forward. Homer. Odysseus went to Penelope and sat. Mark. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives and sat. Homer. Penelope in private questioned her husband in disguise. Mark. 4 of the disciples in private asked him about the destruction of the temple. So let me just pause right here for 1 second and just expand a little bit. Look, already this should clue in if someone was lucky enough to make this connection, this mimetic connection here, and was lucky enough to go, wow, look, in Homer, there's 3 in a row. Amazed, sat, privately questioning motifs, and then in Mark, amazed, sitting, and then privately questioning motifs, all in a row. Those three alone would clue you in to go, wait, whoa, this is strangely interesting that these three were in a row, and they match each other. And already that starts to become improbable, unlikely that would happen on accident, right? But what happens when you keep moving forward and more of them are sequentially in order and they're extremely dense? This is just 2 chapters of Mark, not even 2 full chapters of Mark, so it's extremely dense. I'll continue forward to the 4th example. Homer, Odysseus answered and gave her signs that he had seen her husband and that he would soon return. Mark, Jesus answered and gave the sign when he would return. So like in my opinion, this one example alone, for example, you have 1, 2, 3 mimetic connections in this statement. 1, 2, 3 mimetic connections being formed. So although these are 16 different pairings of statements laid out sequentially here, there's more than 16 actual examples when you look at the actual density of the motifs and the words being used. Next, Homer, that very day Odysseus was consulting the oak sacred to Zeus at Dodona. Mark, the disciples should consult the fig tree. Wow, I mean, this is just getting more and more. Every time another one of these matches up sequentially, the more impossible this becomes. Homer, he is near. Mark, he is near. Homer, all these things will come to pass. Mark, until all these things take place. Homer, no one in Ithaca knew if or when Odysseus would return. Mark, keep watch, for you do not know when the Lord of the house is coming. Homer, the suitors were prepared to kill Telemachus and Odysseus. Mark, the chief priests and scribes were seeking some deceitful way to arrest and kill him. Homer, the suitors feared harm from the people of Ithaca. Mark, the authorities feared a popular uprising. Are you guys seeing what's happening here? I mean, this is completely impossible. Unless done on purpose. Homer, after giving his prophecies to Penelope, Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, sat by himself. Mark, after giving these prophecies to 4 disciples, Jesus sat at a table in a humble home of a leper. Homer, Eurycleia came in with a bowl of water and washed his feet. Later, she anointed him generously with oil. And this is where it gets really, really interesting for those of you who don't know the stories about Eurycleia already. You're going to like this. Mark, a woman came in with an expensive stone jar of ointment and poured the contents on Jesus' head. What are the chances of this, guys? Come on. Next, Homer, when she recognized her master, she dropped his leg into the brass vessel, spilling water. Mark, she broke the jar to release the oil. Homer, she alone recognized her king. And I put, as a little side note, she actually recognizes him by seeing a scar, which is another motif you could point to, although it's not sequential. But it's just another interesting parallel. She recognizes him by seeing his scar. Mark, she alone recognized that Jesus would soon die. So you have this motif of both of them recognizing some secret. Homer, Melantho, the slave girl, had objected to Penelope's generosity to a poor beggar. What are the chances? People at the mill objected to the woman's extravagant anointing. The ointment should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Again, so you have objecting to using the ointment that way, and then the motif of someone poor being in the scene. And again, it's all in order: objection and then poor. Homer, Odysseus and Eurycleia discussed the disloyalty of some of the slaves, and then Mark. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests for the purpose of betraying him. As Dr. McDonald so simply pointed out, those parallels are remarkable, and they certainly qualify for enough whiskers to make a beard. In a discussion of these few examples held during a MythVision podcast episode embedded below, Derek, MythVision's host, perfectly pointed out that there is a literary connection just in the name Eurycleia as well. Dr. MacDonald explains this single example even further. Quote, I delayed the most strikingly unusual parallels until now. Jesus praises the woman by declaring, wherever the good news is proclaimed throughout the world, what this woman has done will also be mentioned in her memory. That is, this woman will have far-flung renown. She will be Eurycleia, renowned far and wide. The significance of the name Eurycleia is noted by an ancient reader. Eurycleia, she who had far flung in great fame. So the very name Eurycleia tells us why this woman is going to have acclamation, because of her act of perceptive generosity, says MacDonald. This is actually a picture of Eurycleia and Odysseus. So put it simply, the name of the woman who washed Odysseus' feet was Eurycleia, a name which means to be known far and wide or broad renowned. Meanwhile, the statement about the woman in Mark's Jesus narrative was that she also would be known far and wide for her acts of kindness, alluding to the very woman who washed Odysseus' feet. And here's the verse from Mark 14:9. It says, Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of her for a memorial. Mark 14:9. And just as a quick side note before I keep reading, this is actually a false prophecy. If you really take it literally, the story of her is not preached every time the gospel is preached anywhere. In fact, I was in church my whole life and I never heard this story being preached in conjunction with the gospel. So it's a false prophecy technically. Anyway, continuing forward, that is a distinctive trait. In Mimesis criticism, we call that a distinctive trait, says Dr. MacDonald. Personally, I can't help but agree. That is a highly distinctive designation and a perfect example of what Mimesis criticism is about, unlocking the truest forms of influence on ancient writers. But some of Dr. MacDonald's opponents have asked, when you identify parallels between the Gospels of Homer, how do you know it's not just Homeric radiation on the culture? And before I continue reading and give you his reply, I just want to quickly note that Homeric radiation is the idea that the writings of Homer were so popular and so well known and so widespread in the regions that the whole culture was influenced by Homer, and therefore the whole culture would have naturally known his stories and would have been influenced by his writings. So how do we know that Homeric radiation just generally on the culture isn't responsible for mimesis, these mimetic connections, is the question. And MacDonald replies, my answer to that is, again, you have to have a criteria for determining whether or not the parallels are literal or cultural. I think for Mark's readers, for example, that they may not have been able to read the Homeric epic. Maybe they didn't know it. Maybe they did know it from the culture. That's actually what I would assume. That doesn't mean the author of Mark doesn't know it or isn't conscious of trying to make this connection. We need criteria for determining it. Exactly. Additionally, some apologists have determined to focus on methodological assaults against Dr. MacDonald's work, in which detractors question the methods through which he draws such parallels. To this, Dr. MacDonald replies, now I'm not saying the imitations of Greek poetry in the Gospels are xerographic. They are not photocopies. They are transvalued. The only way to transvalue something is to make changes in it, but those changes can still be significant. A good example is when my daughter was about 4 years old. A friend of ours gave her a book called Sleeping Ugly. It's obviously about sleeping beauty. The word ugly is the opposite of beauty, so it's still a parallel, but it's a transvaluative parallel. So I don't buy that the differences between texts can't be significant markers to their connection. In other words, sometimes some of the markers that can connect one text to another is through opposites, but it's a distinctive opposite. And of course, if it's dense, sequential, and distinctive, then you still have a mimetic connection, even if they're using opposing thoughts intentionally. The example I give was if I wrote 10 commandments that were exactly the opposite of the 10 commandments of Moses, then 100 years from now, people will obviously look at my work and they'll say, oh, well, he was influenced by the 10 commandments of Moses. How do we know? Because line by line, he went exactly against what Moses had spoken. They would call that a mimetic connection. They would say that I based mine off of his. And so even if even if the distinctive traits don't look exactly similar all the time, they still can be constituted parallel. They still look like markers when you use the right type of methodology. So actually, embedded in the article, I included a few more examples here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like 12 examples from Odyssey books 10 through 12 and Acts 20, 5 through 12. And there's more examples here that if you want to come to the website and take a look at them, you can, or you can pause the video and zoom in here and look at these. But there's just a few more examples. Mimetic connections in Acts and other areas of the New Testament can be found in Dr. MacDonald's work. And what I really encourage you to do is just get the work, get the book, and look at all the examples he has, and look at the work as a whole, because what you're seeing in this video is only but a piece of what's really there. The limited examples provided in this article are only but a few of the many more available within the pages of Dr. MacDonald's book, which you can grab a copy of here. Go ahead and open that up. Here it is, Homeric Epics in the Gospel of Mark, written in 2000. And then here's a quote again by Dr. MacDonald. Now, I'm not saying the imitations of Greek poetry in the Gospels are xerographic. They are not photocopies. They are transvalued. And I wanted to just emphasize that point. All right, and here is my conclusion. Ultimately, even these examples from the Gospel of Mark demonstrate a shocking transvaluative literary process with dense, sequential, and distinctive markers that leave little room for the plausibility that this mimesis could have occurred unintentionally or randomly. Unfortunately for Christian apologists who like to prove both the inerrancy and the originality of the New Testament writings, which were supposedly written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Mimesis criticism demonstrates that the true inspiration for the author of Mark's Gospel was their own love for Homeric prose and Homeric motifs. Dr. Richard Carrier, PhD, historian, author, and activist, the author of On the Historicity of Jesus, Why We Might Have Reason for Doubt, which you can read here, and Jesus from Outer Space, What the Earliest Christians Really Believed About Christ, which you can read here. He responded to this book with a detailed review examining the plausibility and methodology of the arguments presented in Dr. MacDonald's Homeric Epics in the Gospel of Mark. In Carrier's examination, he says, quote, "When I first heard of this, I assumed it would be yet another intriguing but only barely defensible search for parallels, stretching the evidence a little too far tantalizing, but inconclusive. What I found was exactly the opposite. MacDonald's case is thorough, and though many of his points are not as conclusive as he makes them out to be, when taken as a cumulative whole, the evidence is so abundant and clear it cannot be denied. And being a skeptic to the thick, which he definitely is, I would never say this lightly. Several scholars who reviewed or commented on it have said this book will revolutionize the field of gospel studies and profoundly affect our understanding of the origins of Christianity. And though I had taken this for hype, after reading the book, I now echo that very sentiment myself." Dr. Richard Carrier. You can listen to Dr. MacDonald and Derek Lambert read these parallels sequentially and discuss the literature more below. And here's what I did. I went ahead and timestamped it. So if you want to, you can come to the website and click here, and it'll go right into the reading that Derek and Dr. MacDonald present. I'll show you a little clip.
What we're going to do is to read the two parallels like we did last time.
Okay. I'll read Mark, or do you...
I'll be the voice of Homer.
Okay.
You'll be the voice of Mark.
Yes, sir.
So you get the gist. What they're going to do is read you the parallels that I just read you above, and kind of provide a little bit more context. Of course, there's a ton of commentary on this video that I absolutely recommend that everyone check out, watching the first half and the latter half of this video. Additionally, there's another video that they have on Myth Vision Podcast, which includes Richard Carrier, and I recommend that one as well. Dennis R. MacDonald, which is this gentleman right here, received his PhD from Harvard University in 1978 and has taught New Testament and Christian origins at Goshen College, the Iliff School of Theology, and the Claremont School of Theology. From 1999 to 2010, he served as the director of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate University. And if you'd like to, you can read a whole lot more about Dr. MacDonald's credentials, experience, background here. It's very robust, and he has a lot of awards and accolades. Don't forget to thank Derek Lambert at Myth Vision Podcast for sharing Dr. MacDonald's incredible work. By subscribing to his YouTube channel and visiting him at mythvisionpodcast.com. Is Derek's website here, and Derek's channel, which I cannot recommend enough right here. Lots of topics that I agree. I think everyone in this conversation would be very interested in, from not just Christian perspectives, but a lot of different perspectives. And if you'd like to see more of my work, then please join me by subscribing to the Bust and Jest YouTube channel, which you are currently watching, and visiting my homepage on bustandjest.com to join my mailing list. Until next time, I wish you sound logic and a clear mind, Justin. All right, guys. Well, that's essentially it. That is my Mimesis and Mark review. I'm really excited about. I've ordered a couple more of Dr. Carrier and Dr. MacDonald's books, and I'm going to be really diving into those more deeply. But I'm really excited about these mimetic connections and what we've been able to see so far, thanks to Dr. MacDonald. There's additional mimetic connections that I want to kind of point out between Jesus Christ and Titus, and then even others that I want to kind of go into eventually. So look forward to talking more about additional mimetic connections that have been discovered by Dr. MacDonald. So if you enjoyed this content and you really enjoy these type of conversations and discussions, and really being skeptical about what we've been taught in terms of biblical literature and Christian reality, then do me a favor and don't forget to subscribe and join me here on the channel so we can follow along with the conversation and, of course, add your input as we go. I got a whole list of interesting topics, at least I think they're interesting, coming down the pipe for both my website and for YouTube. So make sure you stay tuned and stay connected. Until next time, I'm Justin Best with Bust and Jest. Stay logical, stay rational, and stay away from mind control. Later.